The original sin of slavery.
The original sin of slavery.
Today, Americans are taught when it comes to slavery, America was the worst.
The Atlantic slave trade from Africa to the Americas was different from any other type of slavery.
The United States didn't inherit slavery from anybody. We created it.
American slavery was worse because
the slaves were reduced to property. They were chattel property. No other system of slavery did that except American slavery.
That's complete nonsense.
Wilfred Riley is a political science professor and author of Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me.
Generational slavery, like if you're the son of a slave, you're a slave, that was extraordinarily common. Slavery around the world was slavery.
Books like this, Unfinished Nation.
Yeah.
Slaves in Africa were kept unfree only for a fixed term.
No, is the short answer. Most of the slaves taken by these sort of players would be either kept as slaves for their entire life or, more likely, sold to the whites and the Arabs in 2 years.
Today, partly thanks to the New York Times 1619 Project, students are taught that America's slavery was unlike anything that existed before.
We're the worst society ever. We've done things that no one else has ever done. And sometimes there's nothing wrong with acknowledging your historical mistakes. I mean, I'm Black, Irish, a bit Native American, at least per the family lore. I mean, those are three peoples that have experienced a great deal historically. Nothing wrong with acknowledging that. But it's extremely odd to focus only on the negatives of your society and to exaggerate those.
Americans are taught that slavers caught people in Africa and shipped them here. But few were taught that most slaves were not shipped to the United States.
Between 10.7 million and 12 million slaves from Africa went to the New World. We got a little under 400,000.
Under 400,000 out of 10 million.
The extreme focus on slavery in the United States, why did that happen? One reason is that a lot of Black people survived here. Slavery was harsh, but it's a lot less harsh than clearing the Brazilian jungle.
All right, but American Blacks are at a disadvantage. They have less capital. Financial and educational capital. What's the harm in pointing out how abusive white people were?
The harm is that pointing out how abusive white people were is not going to get Black Americans any more capital. Most of the problems of the modern Black community don't have anything to do with historical ethnic conflict 160 years ago.
The Great Society asked not how much, but how good.
Riley says most of the problems began when welfare began.
Crime in the Black community, every time I've tried to break this out, increased about 800% between, say, 1963 and 1993. Racism didn't increase between 1960 and the modern era. You're looking at the impacts of the Great Society, the welfare programs.
Riley argues it's better to teach the truth, that almost every society had slavery. The Aztecs, the Persians, Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Vikings, and most of all, the Arab world.
The Arabs were probably history's premier slave traders.
Sometimes they captured poor whites from Slavic countries.
The Muslims, many of whom were dark-skinned or even black, took so many blonde slaves out of this region that they gave the word slave to the global slave population.
Many slaves were forced into harems.
Sexual slavery was very much a part of slavery. Like if your group was defeated in war, the men would probably just be killed or they'd be sold as farmhands. The women would often be sold as harem girls or prostitutes.
More than 1 million Europeans were enslaved, but Muslim slave traders took more people from Africa.
The Arabs targeting Africa took out about 17 million people.
The British and then the Americans were the rare people who moved to abolish slavery.
So yeah, the British Navy, in a story almost no one now knows, sank something like 1,600 slave ships. It freed 150,000 people that were enslaved at the time.
Because the Brits objected for moral reasons.
Yeah, they'd had enough of it.
Saudi Arabia only abolished the slave trade relatively recently.
Well, that's another inconvenient fact, right?
The Global Slavery Index estimates that even now, although slavery is officially illegal, there are more than 700,000 slaves in Saudi Arabia.
Where there were no Westerners, you'd have a lot of slavery for a long time. And you do.
American slavery was horrible, but it wasn't unique. Our culture would be healthier if we learned about that. And schools dwelling on America's evils hasn't helped Americans get over them. Gallup polls show that after schools started focusing on oppression race relations got worse.
The idea of generational slavery, the idea of slave trading, none of that was unique to America. And another thing, you don't need radicalism to critique the worst excesses of an existing system. All you need is incrementalism and honesty.
In a few weeks, I'll post a video about another of Riley's myths, the claim that before Columbus, the native people were kind stewards of the environment.
I know every rock and tree and creature has a life, has a spirit, has a name.